Camping alone seemed like a good idea at the time. It wasn't the first time I'd done it, and I loved the peace that came with being away from everything. No phone reception, no noise, no people. Just me, the woods, and the crackle of a campfire. I'd always found something comforting about that isolation. Like the world paused for a bit while I breathed in the scent of pine and listened to the wind weave through the trees. This time, I chose a spot farther out than usual. A little too far, maybe, but it felt right when I first got there. I parked my truck at the trailhead, threw my backpack over my shoulder, and set off down the narrow dirt path. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the clearing, a flat spot near a small stream, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. I set up camp without rushing, enjoying the slow process of pitching the tent, gathering wood for the fire, and boiling water for instant noodles. By the time the sun dropped behind the trees, the fire was going strong, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The air was cool but not too cold, the stars just beginning to show themselves above the treetops. I sat by the fire, ate my dinner, and leaned back against a fallen log, staring up at the night sky. It was one of those moments you dream about when life feels too fast and too loud. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. The first thing that felt off was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. 1 second, the woods were alive with chirping crickets, the soft hoots of owls, and the rustling of leaves. The next, silence, complete and sudden, like someone had thrown a switch. It was the kind of silence that wraps itself around you, thick and heavy, pressing into your ears. I sat up, listening. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. Just a deer moving through the trees, maybe, or a fox sniffing around nearby. Animals get spooked all the time. It wasn't unusual. Still, I found myself reaching for the hatchet I kept next to my pack, just in case. Minutes passed. The fire crackled, the wood popping loudly in the stillness. I strained to hear something, anything, but the silence stretched on. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking, somewhere just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, heart thudding in my chest. The sound had been deliberate, clear, and sharp. Not the random noise of a falling branch or a squirrel. Someone or something had stepped on that twig. I scanned the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust. The firelight only reached so far, leaving the edges of the clearing cloaked in shadow. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, every instinct screaming at me to get up, to move, to do something. But I stayed put, gripping the hatchet so tightly my knuckles turned white. Another snap, this one closer. I rose to my feet slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud it felt like it would give me away. I couldn't see anything, just shadows on top of shadows, but I knew something was out there, watching me. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was another camper, someone who got lost, stumbled across my sight. I should call out, ask if they needed help, but my gut told me not to. Something about the way they were moving, slow, deliberate, felt wrong. I backed up toward the tent, never taking my eyes off the tree line. My pack was inside, along with my flashlight and my knife. If I could just get to it, I'd be fine. I took another step back, and then another. A third snap, closer still. Whoever it was, they were right at the edge of the clearing now, just out of sight. I turned and bolted for the tent, diving inside and yanking the zipper shut behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I swept it across the clearing, searching for movement. Nothing. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all, that the snapping twigs were just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the light caught something, a glint of metal, a pair of eyes reflecting the beam from the bushes. They blinked once, twice, and disappeared. My stomach dropped. That wasn't an animal. It was a person. and they were watching me. The idea of heading out into the woods alone seemed like a good one at first. I needed some time away from everything: work stress, constant noise, and people demanding my attention. A weekend of peace and quiet sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed my gear: a tent, sleeping bag, a decent knife, some freeze-dried meals, a first aid kit, and plenty of water. I made sure my phone was fully charged, although I knew it probably wouldn't get any signal where I was headed. That didn't bother me. I chose a spot deep in the forest, far from any established campgrounds. I wanted solitude, and this was one of those places few people ever visited. The drive out there took hours, first on paved roads, then on dirt ones that got rougher and narrower the deeper I went. By the time I reached the end of the road, it was late afternoon. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and started hiking. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The trees stood close together, their thick trunks blocking most of the sunlight. The air was heavy and still, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely visible, a faint path winding through the underbrush. I followed it for about 2 hours until I found a small clearing near a stream. It seemed like a good spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sound of the water trickling over rocks was the only noise around. I cooked one of my meals, drank some water, and leaned against a tree, watching the sky darken. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. The peace didn't last long. It started with small things, subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Twigs snapping in the distance, the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. Trees creak, animals move through the brush. It's normal, I thought, nothing to worry about. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I scanned the tree-line constantly, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The fire crackled beside me, but it didn't feel like enough to keep the darkness at bay. I kept my knife close, just in case. When it got late, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The ground was hard and cold beneath me, but I was too tired to care. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every sound outside made me jump. A rustling in the leaves, a branch snapping. I told myself it was just raccoons or deer, maybe a fox. They were harmless. Then something heavier moved just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not the quick scurry of an animal. Something or someone was out there. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. I gripped my knife tighter, my fingers trembling. Minutes passed, then hours. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. For a moment, I thought it was the middle of the night, but when I checked my watch, it was almost 6 a.m. The sun should have been rising, but the forest was still cloaked in shadows. Thick clouds hung overhead, blocking out the light. I crawled out of the tent, stretching my stiff limbs. The air was colder than it should have been for early summer, and a strange fog clung to the ground, swirling around my ankles. My fire had burned out during the night, leaving only a pile of cold ash. I decided to pack up and head back. Something didn't feel right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I stuffed my gear into my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail was harder to follow in the dim light, but I kept moving, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. About an hour into the hike, I realized I was lost. The trail had disappeared, swallowed by the underbrush. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The fog made it worse, turning the forest into a maze of shadows and shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I tried not to panic. I had a compass and a map, and I knew the general direction of the road. I just needed to keep my head and stay calm. I set off again, following the compass east. The fog thinned as the morning wore on, but the uneasy feeling lingered. That's when I found the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, old and weathered, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I should have kept walking. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading up to the porch. The door swung open with a groan when I pushed it. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and mildew. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. My breath caught in my throat. I backed out of the cabin, my pulse racing. I didn't know what had happened there, and I didn't want to find out. I turned and started running, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that place. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. The compass was gone, probably lost in my frantic escape. The map was useless without it. Panic set in. I tried to stay calm, but every rational thought slipped away, replaced by a single, overwhelming need to get out. I wandered for hours, calling out occasionally, hoping someone would hear me. No one did. The sun was setting again when I stumbled into another clearing. My heart sank when I saw the cabin. It was the same one. I was sure of it. The same broken furniture, the same carved symbols. Somehow, I had gone in a circle without even realizing it. I didn't go inside this time. I sat on the porch, my head in my hands, trying to think. Night was falling, and I didn't want to be out in the woods after dark. The cabin, creepy as it was, seemed like the safer option. I lit a small fire outside, close enough to the porch that I could retreat inside if I needed to. I sat with my back to the cabin, watching the flames flicker. The woods around me were silent again. Too silent. I heard the footsteps just after midnight, slow and deliberate, moving through the trees. I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight, but I knew something was out there. My knife was in my hand again, the blade catching the firelight. The footsteps circled the clearing, stopping and starting. Whoever or whatever it was, they were toying with me, testing my resolve. I stayed awake all night, watching the darkness, waiting for something to happen. Didn't. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just wanted to get out. I ran until my legs gave out, then I picked myself up and kept going. By some miracle, I found the road around noon. My car was still there, covered in a thin layer of dust. I almost cried with relief. I climbed in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I still don't know what happened in those woods. I tell myself it was just my imagination, that I let the isolation get to me. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there watching me. I haven't gone camping since. The air smelled like pine and damp soil as I parked my car at the trailhead. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. A weekend alone in the wilderness to clear my head. I needed it. Work had been relentless, and I was constantly stuck in traffic, offices, and screens. Out here, I just wanted some peace.
No phones, no distractions.
Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started hiking up the trail. It wasn't a tough hike, but it was long enough to break a sweat. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the dirt path. The sound of my boots crunching against gravel was steady and calming, blending with the chirping of birds. I had downloaded a map of the area, so I knew exactly where I was going. A small clearing beside a lake about 4 miles in. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already hanging low in the sky, painting everything in gold. The lake shimmered, and the air was cool and quiet. Perfect. I set down my pack and stretched, feeling the ache in my shoulders. I found a nice flat spot near the edge of the clearing and set up my tent. After the tent was up, I gathered some firewood from the edge of the trees and built a small fire. It crackled softly as I sat on a rock, eating a granola bar and watching the flames. The sky had darkened to deep blue, and the stars were starting to appear. It felt good to be out here, alone with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. The first sign that something was off happened just after sunset. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it, branches snapping in the woods behind me. At first, I thought it might be a deer. I'd seen fresh tracks on the trail earlier. I turned my head and listened carefully. Another snap, then another. It wasn't the quick, light steps of a deer, though. This was slower, heavier, deliberate. I stood up, my eyes scanning the edge of the tree line. It was hard to see much in the dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of the trees. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound stopped. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon or a porcupine rooting around. I sat back down and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. An hour later, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The forest outside was dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but every little sound kept me on edge. The snapping branches, the heavy footsteps. My mind wouldn't let it go. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. Sometime after midnight, I finally started to drift off. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the clearing. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The only thing separating me from whatever was out there was a thin sheet of nylon. I could hear it breathing slow, steady breaths. I grabbed my knife from my pack, clutching it in my hand. My mind was racing. Who the hell was out here in the middle of nowhere, standing outside my tent? The breathing stopped, and for a few seconds there was complete silence. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, circling the tent. Slow and deliberate, my pulse was hammering in my ears. I could feel the blood rushing through my body. The footsteps stopped again, right at the entrance of the tent. I tightened my grip on the knife, ready for whatever was about to happen. But nothing did. The seconds dragged on like hours. Then I heard the sound of retreating footsteps, moving back toward the tree line. I stayed frozen in place, listening until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't dare move. I lay there in the dark, clutching the knife, my eyes wide open. Sleep was out of the question. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and waiting. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining whoever or whatever it was coming back, standing outside the tent again. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my legs stiff and shaky. The clearing was quiet, bathed in soft morning light. There was no sign of anyone, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human. They led from the tree line to my tent, circled around it, and then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach dropped. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack with trembling hands. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The hike back to the car was the longest 4 miles of my life. Every sound, every movement in the woods sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept glancing behind me, convinced that someone or something was following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I tossed my pack into the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just some random hiker messing with me, but it didn't feel like that. Whoever or whatever it was, they knew I was out there. They watched me, and they wanted me to know they were there. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I've always been someone who likes being outdoors, camping, hiking, getting away from the noise and distractions of the world. That's my kind of escape. There's something about being surrounded by trees, hearing the wind through the leaves, and watching the stars at night that always felt calming. But after what happened last summer, I haven't been back out since. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me and the woods for a few days. I'd done it plenty of times before. Nothing too extreme, just a remote spot up north, far enough to feel isolated but not so remote that I couldn't hike back to civilization if I needed to. I had my gear packed: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, a portable stove, a solid knife, and enough food for 4 days. I even had a little first aid kit just in case. The trail I picked wasn't marked on most maps, but I knew it well. A few miles in, there was a clearing by a small lake that I'd camped at before. It was perfect, quiet, tucked away, and rarely visited by anyone else. Exactly what I was looking for. The hike in was uneventful. The trail was a little overgrown, but that was normal for this time of year. The weather was clear, sunny but not too hot, with a nice breeze that kept the bugs away. I made good time, reaching the clearing in the early afternoon. I set up camp near the edge of the lake. The ground was flat, and there was plenty of space for my small tent. After pitching it, I gathered some firewood and stacked it near the fire pit I'd built on a previous trip. Everything felt routine, almost too easy. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate some dehydrated meals, and watched the stars. The night sky out there was incredible, so many stars that it almost felt overwhelming. I didn't bother with my phone. There was no signal anyway, and that was the whole point of coming out here, to disconnect. I slept well that night. The sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore made for perfect white noise. The next day started just as smoothly. I cooked a simple breakfast, drank some coffee, and spent the morning exploring the area. There was an old logging road a little ways off the trail, and I thought it might be interesting to follow it for a bit and see where it led. The road was barely recognizable, just 2 faint ruts in the dirt, almost completely reclaimed by the forest. I followed it for a while, taking my time, enjoying the quiet. But after about an hour, I got a weird feeling. It's hard to explain. Nothing was obviously wrong, but something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just dead silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sometimes the woods get quiet. Maybe there was a predator nearby, and everything had gone still because of that. Still, the feeling stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I decided to head back to camp. When I got back, everything looked normal. My tent was still there, untouched. My gear was exactly where I'd left it. I felt silly for being so on edge, so I made lunch and tried to shake it off. But the feeling didn't go away. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near my tent. Big ones, way bigger than my own. They looked fresh. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't boot prints, just the outline of bare feet, deep in the dirt. The toes were spread wide, almost like whoever left them had been walking barefoot for a long time. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another camper had passed through while I was out. It didn't make much sense. Why would someone be wandering around barefoot in the middle of the woods? But it was the only explanation I could come up with. Still, it bothered me. I decided to keep a closer eye on things. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump. The wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. The crackle of the fire dying down felt too deliberate, like someone was creeping around just out of sight. I kept my knife close and barely closed my eyes. The next morning, I found more footprints. This time, they were closer to my tent, circling it. They weren't just passing by. They were deliberate, like someone had been walking around, watching. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, but the zipper on my tent's front flap was open about an inch. I was sure I'd closed it all the way before bed. That feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I packed up some essentials, water, food, my knife, and decided to take a day hike just to clear my head. I figured some distance might help me think straight. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone, just shadows and trees. Then, about 2 miles from camp, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pile of stones, carefully stacked in the middle of the trail. It looked deliberate, like a marker or a warning. The stones were smooth and round, taken from the lake and stacked in a perfect little tower. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, I walked around it and kept going, but the unease was almost unbearable. I got back to camp just before sunset. The first thing I noticed was that my firewood pile had been disturbed. Logs were scattered across the ground, like someone had kicked them around. I froze, listening. Nothing. The woods were dead silent again. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there, but it was getting dark fast. Hiking out in the dark wasn't a great idea, especially with how rough the trail was. I decided to wait until morning. I built a big fire and sat with my back to the tent, knife in hand. The night stretched on forever. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, just outside the ring of firelight. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling the camp. I couldn't see anything beyond the light of the fire, just darkness and shadows. Then the footsteps stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. For the next few hours, nothing happened. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, and the footsteps never came back. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't bother eating or breaking down my tent properly. I just grabbed my essentials and started hiking. The trail felt longer on the way out. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps behind me, but they never came. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. I still don't know who or what was out there with me. I've thought about it a lot since then, tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was another camper, someone messing with me. But the bare footprints, the stone pile, the footsteps in the dark, it doesn't add up. I haven't been back to that trail since. Every time I think about going camping again, I remember those footprints, that feeling of being watched, and I can't do it. Some things are better left unexplored. It started as a simple camping trip. I needed a break from everything: work, the constant noise of the city, and even people. The idea of solitude sounded perfect. Just me, the forest, a tent, and the sky full of stars. I thought it would help clear my mind, maybe give me some kind of clarity I'd been searching for lately. I chose a remote campsite deep in the woods. No marked trails, no nearby campers, and not a single sign of human life for miles. That's what I wanted, silence and isolation. The plan was to stay for 2 nights. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, a knife, a map, a flashlight, and a few other essentials. My phone had no signal out there, which I already knew going in. I figured it was part of the experience. Disconnecting from everything for a while felt good at first. The first day was peaceful. I hiked through thick trees, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call. The air was fresh, cool, and smelled like pine. I found a nice flat spot near a small stream and set up my tent. After pitching the tent and gathering some firewood, I sat by the water and ate a sandwich, enjoying the quiet. As the sun began to set, the forest around me changed. The light filtering through the trees turned golden, then orange, then disappeared altogether. The temperature dropped quickly, and the forest grew darker than I had expected. It felt like it swallowed the light completely once the sun was gone. My campfire flickered weakly, barely pushing back the darkness around me. I didn't mind at first. Darkness is part of the woods, after all. It's not like I was scared of the dark. I was prepared for it. I had a flashlight, and the fire was enough to keep me warm and safe for the night. But then came the sounds. At first, it was just a soft rustling in the trees. Probably the wind, I thought, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. The rustling grew louder, moving through the trees behind me. It wasn't constant. It came and went in short bursts, like something or someone was moving from tree to tree. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only reached a few feet before getting swallowed by the dark. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling that something was there didn't go away. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer. They're common out here, nothing to worry about. But my instincts were screaming at me that it wasn't. The sound stopped for a while. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Spending time alone in the woods can mess with your head. Your mind plays tricks on you. I knew that. Still, I kept the fire going, adding more wood than necessary just to keep it bright. Eventually, I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I kept my knife next to me, just in case. I wasn't afraid. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But my heart wouldn't slow down. I listened carefully for any sounds outside the tent. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to total silence. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was pitch black. My tent felt suffocatingly small, the air inside stale and cold. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. I froze, holding my breath. It was right outside the tent, just a few feet away. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, not like an animal at all. They stopped directly in front of the tent. I could hear breathing deep and steady. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever it was to move on. Didn't. Instead, something pressed against the side of the tent. Not hard, but enough to make the fabric bow inward slightly. I could see the shape of a hand, or at least something that looked like one, pressing against the nylon. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just stayed perfectly still, holding the knife, waiting for whatever was out there to go away. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps moved away from the tent, slowly fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there in the dark, knife in hand, listening to every little sound. By the time the sun finally rose, I felt like a shell of myself. My body ached from lying in the same position for hours. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my mind was racing. I packed up my gear in record time, barely eating breakfast. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sticking around to find out more. The hike back felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my heart racing. I kept checking behind me, convinced I was being followed, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. I threw my backpack in the trunk and got inside, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath, trying to process everything. As I drove back toward civilization, the fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. I was safe. Whatever had been out there in the woods was far behind me now. But as I reached into my pocket for my phone, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My knife, the one I had held onto all night, was gone. I had no memory of dropping it or leaving it behind. It was just gone. I still think about that camping trip sometimes. I haven't been back to the woods since. People ask me why, and I just tell them I prefer the beach now. I don't tell them about the sounds, or the hand on the tent, or the missing knife. Some things are better left unsaid. It started out as a simple weekend getaway. The plan was to leave the city, head into the woods, and spend a couple of nights camping by myself. I needed a break from everything: work, traffic, noise. Just me, my tent, and nature. I'd done it before, and honestly, it always helped clear my head. But this trip would be different. I didn't realize it at the time, but it would be the last solo camping trip I'd ever take. I parked my car at the edge of a forest reserve around noon on Friday. The air was cool and fresh, and the trail looked just as I remembered it from a couple of years back. Narrow but well-trodden. My pack felt heavier than usual, but I chalked it up to bringing some extra supplies. I wasn't in a rush. The spot I had in mind was about 5 miles in, a small clearing near a creek that curved gently through the trees. I'd camped there before and liked how quiet it was, far from the usual campsites and crowds. The hike was uneventful at first. Birds chirped overhead, and the sun filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns on the ground. I walked steadily, stopping every so often to take a sip of water or adjust my pack. After about 2 hours, I reached the clearing. It looked exactly how I remembered it: soft grass, surrounded by tall pines, with the creek about 50 feet away. Perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the trees, and unpacked my gear. It was still early in the afternoon, so I took my time. I laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some firewood, and even stretched out on the grass for a bit, just enjoying the quiet. Felt good to be away from everything. By the time evening rolled around, I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and some beef jerky, and ate while the sky turned from blue to a deep, rich orange. The woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Felt peaceful. I sat by the fire for a while, letting the warmth soak into my skin, and then decided to call it a night. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a vague sense of unease, the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something: a crack, a rustle, footsteps. I wasn't sure. I kept telling myself it was just the woods. Animals move around at night. It's normal. But the sounds felt too deliberate, too close. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up, unzipped the tent, and shined my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but trunks and leaves. I scanned the area, moving the light slowly from side to side. Nothing, just the woods. I took a deep breath and crawled back into the tent, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to complete silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Even the crickets had stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear anything. And then I did. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from just beyond the tree line, moving toward my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly that it took me a second to turn it on. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening, waiting. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. And then, just as I started to think I'd imagined it, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was light, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. My blood ran cold. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. Another soft rustle, then silence again. I don't know how long I sat there, flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off again because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything looked normal. But it didn't feel normal. I stepped out of the tent, blinking in the bright light, and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I noticed the footprints. They were faint, but they were there, in the soft dirt around my tent. Large, barefoot human footprints. My stomach dropped. I'd camped in this spot before and never seen anything like that. I tried to tell myself they were old, that maybe someone had passed through here days ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I spent most of the morning on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or stupidity. I told myself I'd come all this way for a reason, and I wasn't going to let some weird footprints ruin my trip. The day passed uneventfully. I went for a hike, gathered more firewood, and tried to shake the lingering feeling of unease. By the time evening rolled around, I was starting to feel a bit more like myself. I cooked another simple meal, sat by the fire, and watched the stars come out. But as the sky darkened, the feeling returned. That same sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, but it was no use. My eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the trees, searching for movement. And then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the firelight, standing perfectly still, watching me. Couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, not moving. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the figure, but by the time the beam reached the spot, it was gone. I stood there, light sweeping back and forth, pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but where would I go? It was miles back to the car, and the trail would be almost impossible to navigate in the dark. So I did the only thing I could think of. I fed the fire, making it bigger, brighter. I sat with my back to the tent, flashlight in one hand, a large stick in the other, and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened.
No footsteps. No rustling.
Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of an owl. Eventually, exhaustion took over again, and I must have fallen asleep sitting up. When I woke up, the fire was nothing but embers. The first light of dawn was creeping through the trees. I looked around, muscles stiff and sore from sleeping in such an awkward position. Everything seemed quiet, normal, but then I saw the footprints again. Fresh ones circling my camp. Whoever or whatever had been watching me had gotten closer during the night. Much closer. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing around, half expecting to see the figure again. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me twice as long as usual to get everything into my pack. The hike back to the car was the longest 5 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. But if I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the car, I practically threw my pack into the back seat and jumped behind the wheel. My hands were still trembling as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I started to feel like I could breathe again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing. I never went back to that spot. Hell, I haven't been camping since. I still think about it sometimes, though. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows start to feel a little too deep. I think about those footprints, about the figure in the woods, about how close it got while I was sleeping, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. I can still remember how the air smelled that weekend, crisp and sharp with the bite of late October. The kind of cold that hadn't quite settled in for the winter but was enough to make your breath hang in the air like smoke. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, just me and a few days in the woods to clear my head. I'd been working too much, sleeping too little, and I figured some fresh air and solitude would do me good. I chose a spot about 3 hours outside the city, deep in a national forest with trails that weren't too busy, especially in the off-season. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing anyone, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, a small camp stove, some freeze-dried meals, a couple of protein bars, and plenty of water. The first day was uneventful, which was how I liked it. I hiked about 10 miles along a trail that followed a winding creek. The trees were mostly bare, their leaves piled on the forest floor in thick drifts that crunched under my boots. The sun was out, but it didn't give much warmth. I reached a small clearing just before sunset and set up camp. The spot was perfect: flat ground, close enough to the creek for water but far enough away that I wouldn't hear it all night. I ate dinner by the fire and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to black. The stars were bright, brighter than they ever were back home. I sat there for a while, just staring at them, feeling small in the best way. It wasn't until the fire burned down to glowing coals that I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, makes you aware of your own breathing. I lay there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a squirrel or a raccoon. Animals are always moving around at night, but something felt off. It wasn't a sound that had woken me. It was more like a feeling, the kind that raises the hair on the back of your neck. I tried to go back to sleep, but it didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I was being paranoid. I made coffee on the camp stove and ate a protein bar for breakfast. The sunlight filtering through the trees made everything feel less ominous. I packed up camp and continued down the trail. I told myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods like this. Back home, there were always people around, neighbors, cars driving by, the hum of the city. Out here, it was just me and the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was late afternoon when I found the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. I had been looping back toward the spot where I'd started, and it wasn't unusual to cross your own trail on these kinds of hikes. But when I looked closer, I realized they weren't. They were too big, and they were fresh. I crouched down, my pulse quickening. The prints were deep, pressed into the damp earth. Whoever had made them wasn't just walking, they were running. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees seemed to close in on me, their bare branches like skeletal fingers. I told myself it was probably a hunter. There were plenty of them in these woods, especially this time of year. But something about the tracks made my skin crawl. They didn't follow the trail. They cut across it at an angle, disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the footprints vanished. Then I kept walking. I found the cabin just before sunset. It wasn't on my map, which was strange. Most old cabins and shelters were marked, even if they were abandoned. This one looked like it had been forgotten for a long time. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were dark and empty. I almost didn't stop. Something about the place made me uneasy, but the sun was sinking fast, and I didn't want to be caught in the dark again. I pushed the door open. It creaked on rusty hinges, the sound echoing in the empty woods. The inside was just as bad as the outside, dust and cobwebs everywhere. A broken table in the corner, an old wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner, as far from the door as possible. I didn't bother with a fire. I just ate another protein bar and climbed into my sleeping bag, telling myself that I'd leave first thing in the morning. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, not outside, inside. They were slow, deliberate, heavy enough that I could feel them through the floor. My heart was in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The footsteps stopped right next to me. I could hear breathing. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. Felt like hours. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I heard the door open and close, and then everything was quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my pack and got out of there. I didn't bother packing up properly. I just stuffed everything into my bag and started walking. Fast. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I just kept moving, my eyes darting to every shadow, every rustling leaf. The trail felt different in the daylight, less like a path and more like a trap. I reached the parking lot just after noon. My car was the only one there. I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. It wasn't until I was back on the highway that I finally let myself breathe. It wasn't until later, after I'd showered and eaten and started to feel like myself again, that I realized something. The cabin didn't have any windows, so how did they know exactly where I was lying? I still think about that sometimes. I haven't been camping since. Started as a weekend trip, a chance to clear my head. I had been working nonstop for months, and my body felt worn down. Sleep had been rare, and my focus had slipped to a dangerous level. I needed a break. I figured heading out to the woods for a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to reset. I wasn't new to the outdoors. I'd done plenty of hiking and camping before, always prepared and cautious. This wasn't supposed to be some extreme adventure. Just me, a tent, and the peace of nature. The plan was simple. Drive out early Friday morning, set up camp near a quiet spot I'd found on a map, spend 2 nights, and head back Sunday afternoon. The place wasn't well known, which is what drew me to it. No crowded campgrounds or noisy hikers, just solitude. I reached the trailhead around noon. The weather was perfect, blue skies, warm sun, and a light breeze that kept the bugs away. My backpack was packed with everything I'd need. Food, water, first aid kit, sleeping bag, a small tent, and a knife I always carried when camping. My phone had no signal out here, but I wasn't worried. I had a map, a compass, and enough experience to feel confident. The trail was barely a trail at all, just a faint path through the trees. I walked for about an hour before I found a clearing that seemed perfect. The ground was flat, with enough space for my tent, and there was a small stream nearby for water. I set up camp, gathered some firewood, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. Felt good to be out there, peaceful. The rest of the day passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, watched the sun dip behind the trees, and listened to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. I crawled into my tent early, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I fell asleep almost immediately. The first night was uneventful. I woke up with the sun, brewed some coffee on my little camp stove, and spent the morning exploring the area. The woods were dense, but not oppressive. There were animal tracks here and there, deer mostly, and I spotted a few birds I didn't recognize. Felt like I had the whole world to myself. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but content. I spent some time gathering more firewood, then sat down to eat. That's when I noticed something strange. A pile of sticks near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I'd walked that way earlier and would have noticed it. The sticks were stacked in a rough pyramid shape, almost like a makeshift marker. I walked over and kicked it apart without thinking much of it. Maybe a hiker had passed through and left it there as a joke. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. Either way, it didn't matter. The second night was different. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound just outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I lay there, perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, but it didn't move like an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too slow. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in my hand. I listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The sound stopped after a minute, and I didn't hear it again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but it was a restless sleep. I kept waking up at every little noise. When morning came, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been alone for almost 2 days now, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're isolated. I decided to stay close to camp that day. My plan was to leave early the next morning, and I didn't want to push my luck. I spent most of the day tidying up the camp and reading a book I'd brought along. By late afternoon, I was starting to feel more relaxed again. I even laughed at myself for being so jumpy the night before. Then I found the second pile of sticks. It was in the same spot as the first one, stacked in the exact same way. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't put it there. I'd kicked apart the first pile the day before, and I hadn't seen anyone else out here. Someone was messing with me. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but the woods were silent. Too silent. The normal background noise, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves was gone. I stood there for a long time, my eyes darting from tree to tree, but I didn't see anything. I kicked the pile apart again, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the wind had knocked the sticks together somehow. I told myself whatever I needed to hear to stay calm. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening. Every little sound made me jump. I kept imagining footsteps outside, the zipper on my tent being pulled open, someone standing over me in the dark. But nothing happened.
No footsteps. No strange sounds.
When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I wanted to get out of there. The unease I'd felt since the second night had grown into full-blown dread. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I hiked back to the trailhead, my heart pounding the whole way. I was about a mile from the trailhead when I found the third pile of sticks. It was right in the middle of the trail. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. This one was bigger than the others, taller, more carefully stacked. Someone had been following me. I didn't wait to figure out why. I started running. My pack bounced against my back, and my legs burned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get to my car. Every step felt like someone was right behind me, just out of sight. I imagined turning around and seeing someone standing there, watching me. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw my pack in the back and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My heart was racing, and my chest felt tight. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. I started the car and drove away without looking back. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some random person trying to mess with me. Maybe they thought it was funny. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a warning, a reminder that the woods aren't always as peaceful as they seem. I haven't been camping since. I keep telling myself I'll go back someday. But every time I think about it, I see that last pile of sticks on the trail, and I remember the feeling of being watched. Maybe I'll stick to day hikes for a while. I never thought camping could go so wrong. I've been on plenty of trips before. Nothing fancy, just me, the woods, and a weekend of peace and quiet. But this time, something felt off right from the start. I should have trusted that gut feeling. Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have spiraled the way they did. It all started with a last-minute plan. I had a free weekend and wanted to get away. Life had been chaotic lately. Work deadlines, social commitments, all the usual stuff that wears you down. I needed a break, some fresh air, and the kind of silence you can only find deep in the woods. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, a secluded area in the national forest about 2 hours from home. It wasn't a well-marked campsite, just a patch of woods I'd found through a hiking forum. Quiet, remote, perfect for what I needed. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, my old camping stove, enough food for 2 days, a knife, flashlight, some extra batteries, and a water filter. I always travel prepared, but not over the top. The drive was uneventful. I left early Saturday morning, stopping once for gas and coffee. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and the temperature hovering in the mid-60s. Ideal camping weather. The forest road leading to the trailhead was rougher than I remembered. The dirt was loose, and there were deep ruts from recent rain. My car bounced and rattled as I made my way down, dust kicking up behind me. I was the only car there when I arrived. Good, that's what I wanted. I parked, shouldered my pack, and set off. The trail was faint but still visible. It wound through a dense forest of pines and oaks, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Birds called from high in the branches, and the smell of pine sap filled the air. I walked for about an hour, maybe more, before finding a spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing with just enough flat ground for my tent. A fallen tree nearby would serve as a decent bench, and there was a little stream a short walk downhill. Perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and gathered some firewood. I wasn't planning on a big fire, just enough to cook dinner and keep me warm as the evening chill set in. By late afternoon, everything was ready. I boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, ate slowly, and watched the sunlight filter through the trees. Time seemed to stretch out in that peaceful way it does when you're far from the noise of everyday life. As the sun dipped lower, I built a small fire. I sat there for hours, feeding it occasionally, lost in thought. The woods were quiet, aside from the crackling flames and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The stars came out, brighter than I'd seen in months. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. First, I thought it was part of a dream, but no, there it was again. Soft, deliberate, crunching through the leaves just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the rhythm of those steps felt wrong. Too steady, too slow. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled my tent, pausing now and then. Crunch, crunch, stop. Silence. Then they started again, closer this time. My hand crept toward my knife. I gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped right next to my tent. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent started to move. I lunged, slashing at the fabric with my knife, yelling as loud as I could. There was a thud, a scuffle, and the footsteps retreated, crashing through the underbrush. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, heart racing. I swept the beam of light across the trees, but there was no sign of whoever or whatever it was. My tent was torn, the zipper half open. I stood there, shivering in the cold night air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who the hell had been out here? Why were they messing with my tent? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in my lap, scanning the darkness for any movement. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. To first light, I packed up. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what that was all about. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every sound made me jump. I kept my knife in hand, the blade slick with morning dew. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was just where I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I climbed in and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. I started the engine and turned onto the forest road, eager to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But about a mile down the road, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another set of tire tracks, fresh ones, leading into the woods. I wasn't alone out there. Someone else had been nearby, someone who'd arrived after me. I drove faster, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway, the forest far behind me. It's been months since that trip, but I still think about it. I've told myself it was probably just some other camper, maybe a hunter who got too curious for their own good. But deep down, I know that's not true. I haven't been camping since. Maybe I'll go back someday. Maybe not. One thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night. It started as a weekend camping trip, a way to disconnect, clear my head, and escape from the constant buzz of city life. I had been looking forward to it all week. Just me, a tent, and the deep quiet of nature. I chose a remote spot in the national forest, far enough from the usual campgrounds to feel truly alone. I wanted solitude, and I was going to get it. The drive took about 3 hours. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt road that snaked through thick woods, bumping and jolting my old SUV. My phone lost service somewhere along the way, but I didn't care. That was part of the appeal. By the time I parked at a small clearing and unloaded my gear, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I found a spot to set up camp about 100 yards from where I parked. It was a small, flat clearing surrounded by tall trees. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and gathered some rocks to build a fire ring. Once everything was set up, I sat down on a log, cracked open a beer, and watched the sky turn from orange to pink to deep blue as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. As darkness settled in, I lit a fire. The flames crackled and danced, throwing flickering shadows across the trees. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just some canned chili and a piece of bread. It wasn't gourmet, but it hit the spot. After eating, I leaned back and stared up at the stars. Out here, far from the city lights, they were dazzling, millions of tiny points of light scattered across the black canvas of the sky. Time slipped by. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the woods around me grew quiet. I felt a deep sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being alone in nature. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was cool but not too cold, and the steady chirp of crickets lulled me to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire outside had long since gone out, and the tent was pitch black. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. There was no obvious sound or disturbance, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I lay still, straining to hear something, anything. For a moment, I thought it might have been a dream that startled me awake. But then I heard it, a faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. They didn't have that erratic shuffle of an animal foraging in the dark. These were slow, careful footsteps moving closer. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as something or someone brushed against the nylon wall. My mind raced. Who could it be? I was miles from the nearest town, far off any main trail. No one should be out here. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the thudding of my own heartbeat. I lay there for a long time, too scared to move, listening for any hint that they might come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, the forest seemed peaceful again, almost as if the events of the night before had been a bad dream. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and everything looked normal. But when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the dirt around my campsite. They circled the tent once, then led off into the woods. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just another camper who had gotten lost and stumbled onto my site. Still, the thought didn't sit well with me. Why would someone be wandering around my tent in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. I went for a hike, explored a nearby stream, and tried to enjoy the beauty of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me glancing over my shoulder. By late afternoon, I decided that one night was enough. I'd had my fill of solitude. It was time to head back to civilization. I packed up my gear quickly, trying not to think about the footsteps or the strange silence that seemed to have settled over the woods. As I loaded the last of my things into the SUV, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of there as fast as possible. I started the engine, backed out of the clearing, and headed down the dirt road. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The trees seemed to close in around the narrow road, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the sky. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. When I finally hit the main road, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove straight through without stopping until I reached home. Only then did I allow myself to relax. I took a long shower, ordered takeout, and tried to forget about the trip. But I couldn't. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events in my head. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It all felt too real to be my imagination. I thought about the footprints around my tent and the way they had circled me while I slept. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, waiting. I haven't gone camping since. I never thought I'd be the type of person to experience something like this, a story you read about in some survival magazine or watch in a low-budget thriller film. But it happened, and I still can't shake it. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the cold grip of fear wrapping around my chest again, just like it did that night in the woods. It started as a solo camping trip, something I'd done plenty of times before. I was craving some quiet and a little break from the noise of everyday life. Work had been overwhelming, and I just needed to reset. The plan was simple. Hike out to a spot I'd scouted months before, set up camp, and spend a couple of days with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional crackle of a campfire. I chose a spot deep in the forest, about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. It wasn't a popular area, which was perfect for me. No people meant no distractions. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, but I liked that about it. Felt untouched, wild. My pack was loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and a good knife. I had my GPS and a map, though I knew the area well enough to navigate without them. The hike in was uneventful, just the way I liked it. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the canopy in patches of golden light. Birds called to each other in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves signaled the presence of small animals nearby. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd been hoping for. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream about 50 yards away. The ground was soft but not muddy, perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. Felt good to be there, away from everything. I spent the rest of the day gathering firewood and exploring the immediate area. There was no sign of other campers, no trash, no old fire pits, nothing. Just me and the forest. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature dropped quickly once the light faded, and I pulled on a fleece jacket, enjoying the warmth of the flames. The night was uneventful at first. I sat by the fire for a while, sipping hot tea and staring into the flickering light. There's something about a campfire that makes you lose track of time. Eventually, the fire burned down to glowing embers, and I decided it was time to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The soft hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant gurgle of the stream. It was comforting, familiar. I closed my eyes and let myself drift off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual background noise was gone. No owls, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but the steps were deliberate, measured, not the random movements of an animal foraging for food. I reached for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, moving closer. I could hear them circling my tent, slow and steady. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was another camper who'd gotten lost. But why wouldn't they call out? Why just circle the tent like that? The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The fabric of the tent rustled, as if someone was brushing their hand against it. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to yell, to confront whoever or whatever was out there, but fear kept me frozen. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign that they might come back. But the forest remained silent. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. I lay there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream, some weird trick of my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Everything looked normal. The fire pit was undisturbed, my gear untouched. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, circling the tent. They were human, barefoot. My stomach churned. I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was, they'd come and gone in the middle of the night, without a word, without taking anything. My instincts screamed at me to pack up and leave, but a stubborn part of me refused. I'd come out here for peace, for solitude. I wasn't going to let some weirdo ruin that. I convinced myself that it was probably just some eccentric local messing with me, trying to scare me off. I spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the way they'd circled the tent. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I debated whether to stay another night. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But another part of me refused to be scared off. I decided to stay, but I took precautions. I moved my tent to a different spot, deeper into the trees, where it would be harder to find. I built a smaller fire and kept it low, not wanting to draw attention. Night fell quickly, wrapping the forest in darkness. I sat by the fire, my back against a tree, my knife within easy reach. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The usual night sounds returned: owls hooting, leaves rustling in the breeze. Slowly, my tension began to ease. But just as I was starting to think I'd overreacted, I heard it again. Footsteps, coming from the direction of my old campsite. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I doused the fire, plunging myself into darkness. I crouched low, blending into the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I could just make out a figure standing there, silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. They stood still for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't move until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. My body ached from staying in the same position for so long, but I didn't care. I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The hike back to the trailhead felt like it took twice as long as it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure standing there, watching me, but the forest remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road that led back to civilization. I never went back to that spot. I told myself it was just some local messing with me, some harmless prank. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They'd been watching me, waiting. And that's the kind of fear that sticks with you long after you've left the woods behind. It started as a simple trip, just a weekend out in the woods to escape the noise and stress of everyday life. I'd always liked being outdoors. There was something about the quiet, the smell of pine and damp earth, that helped clear my head. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, some basic food, a flashlight, and a knife. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, a little cool at night, but nothing that worried me. I had planned on hiking about 6 miles into the forest to a remote campsite I'd read about online. Supposedly, it was peaceful and rarely visited. Just what I needed. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and set off around mid-morning. The first few miles were easy, the trail well-marked and smooth. Birds were chirping, and I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Occasionally, I'd pass a stream or a small clearing where the sunlight poured in, lighting everything up in a soft golden glow. It felt like I had the whole place to myself. I stopped a couple of times to drink water and take in the scenery, but I kept moving, wanting to get to the campsite with enough daylight left to set up and gather firewood. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The birdsong faded, and the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out most of the light. The air felt heavier, damp and cool, with that earthy smell that comes from layers of rotting leaves and moss-covered logs. It wasn't exactly creepy, but it had an edge to it. Something about being that far out alone makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement around you. I reached the campsite around mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a fire pit made of stones in the center and just enough flat ground for my tent. There was no sign anyone had been there recently, no footprints, no trash, nothing. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started gathering wood for a fire. By the time the sun began to set, I had a decent pile of wood and a small fire crackling in the pit. I cooked some instant noodles, ate in silence, and sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the night settle in around me. It was peaceful. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. As darkness fully settled, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees looked like walls, their trunks black against the dim light of the fire. I felt exposed sitting there in the middle of that clearing, so I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. It wasn't much of a barrier, just a thin layer of nylon, but it made me feel a little safer. I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion from the hike catching up with me. But at some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there in the dark, listening. It was dead silent outside. No wind, no insects, nothing. That kind of silence makes your ears strain, trying to pick up anything, even the faintest sound. Then I heard it, a soft crunch. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a footstep on dry leaves, just outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached slowly for my knife, my fingers closing around the handle. I didn't move otherwise. I just lay there, straining to hear where the sound was coming from. Crunch. It was circling my tent, the footsteps slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever. Didn't care if I heard them. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. This was a person. I kept my grip on the knife and waited. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, just inches from my head. I could hear breathing now, slow and steady. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, listening. My mind raced. Should I yell? Try to scare them off? Or stay quiet and hope they went away? The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They faded into the distance until all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I lay there for a long time, knife in hand, waiting to see if they would come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was just before dawn. The sky was a pale gray, and the forest was waking up around me. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. It almost felt normal. Almost. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my knife still in my hand. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but there were clear footprints circling the tent. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. Definitely not an animal. I packed up quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The hike back to the car was the longest 6 miles of my life. I didn't stop, didn't take a break, just kept moving as fast as I could without breaking into a full-on run. My pulse pounded in my ears the entire time, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried from relief. I threw my backpack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, catching my breath. I never saw who it was, never found out what they wanted or why they were out there in the middle of nowhere, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. But I do know one thing: I'm never going camping alone again. I always loved camping. There was something about being out there, away from the noise of the city, surrounded by nothing but trees, the sky, and the smell of pine needles. It made me feel free, grounded. I wasn't exactly a seasoned outdoorsman, but I knew my way around a tent and a campfire. I'd gone on solo trips before, and this one wasn't supposed to be any different. Just me, the woods, and a weekend of quiet. I picked a spot deep in the forest, miles from any trailhead. I wanted isolation, the kind you can only find when your phone has no signal and the nearest human being is probably a good 2-hour hike away. I parked my car at the edge of an old logging road and trekked in with everything I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, a couple of meals, water, a knife, and a small first aid kit. Simple and light. The first day was perfect. The sun hung high in a cloudless sky, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. I found a nice flat spot near a creek and set up camp. The water was clear and cold, cutting a gentle path through the rocks. After setting up the tent, I spent the afternoon gathering firewood and just enjoying the peace. As night fell, I got a fire going and cooked a simple meal. I sat by the fire for hours, watching the flames dance, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. The stars were out in full force, and it felt like I could see every constellation. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this little pocket of the world all to myself. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when your body is truly tired and your mind is at ease. When I woke up, the sun was already creeping through the trees, and the air was crisp and cool. I made coffee on my camp stove and ate a quick breakfast before deciding to do some exploring. I didn't have a map of the area, but I wasn't worried. I had a decent sense of direction, and I wasn't planning on going too far. That I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the way it twisted and turned through the forest. After about an hour, I came across an old, overgrown trail. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it piqued my curiosity. I decided to follow it. The trail was narrow and choked with brush in some places, but it was still passable. It climbed steadily upward, and before long, I found myself on a ridge overlooking the valley below. The view was stunning. The forest stretched out in every direction, a sea of green broken only by the silver ribbon of the creek far below. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. That's when I noticed something odd. Off to the right, maybe 50 yards down the ridge, was a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof was partially caved in, and the wood was gray and weathered. Curious, I made my way over to it. The cabin was small, just a single room with a sagging porch. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were broken. I stepped inside, careful not to put too much weight on the floorboards. The interior was bare except for a rusted wood stove in one corner and a pile of rotting wood in another. It smelled of damp and decay. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange on the far wall. There were scratches in the wood, long and deep, like something had clawed at it. They formed no discernible pattern, just random, frenzied marks. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was probably just from an animal, a bear, maybe. Or maybe someone had been trapped in the cabin during a storm and tried to claw their way out. It didn't matter. It was old, whatever it was. Nothing to worry about. I left the cabin and made my way back to camp. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and I didn't want to get caught out after dark. By the time I got back, the air was cooling rapidly, and the forest was bathed in that golden light that only comes at the end of the day. I got another fire going and cooked dinner, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scratches on the wall. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old cabin in the woods, nothing more. But every time the wind rustled the trees outside, I found myself straining to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was restless, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. I woke up just before dawn, the sky a pale gray, and decided to get an early start. I packed up camp quickly, eager to put some distance between me and that cabin. The hike back to my car was uneventful at first. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, almost oppressive. I kept my eyes on the trail, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. But as I got closer to where I'd parked, I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. The mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to me, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. I started glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. By the time I reached my car, my nerves were shot. I threw my pack in the back seat and got behind the wheel, locking the doors out of instinct. I sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding in my chest. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. It was then that I noticed the footprints. They were in the dirt just a few feet from my car. Fresh footprints, large, barefoot. They led out of the woods and stopped right at the driver's side door. My blood went cold. I didn't wait to investigate. I started the car and got out of there as fast as I could, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the old logging road. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my mind racing the entire way. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else out there the entire weekend. Whoever had made them had been there recently, maybe even while I was asleep in my tent. It's been a few months since that trip, and I haven't been camping since. I keep telling myself it was nothing, just some harmless drifter passing through. But deep down, I know better. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something isn't right. And something about that trip wasn't right. The air was cold, crisp, and carried the unmistakable scent of pine as I set off on my hike. I'd planned this trip for weeks, eager to explore the secluded trail that wound through the mountains. It was early autumn, and the woods were beginning to change, the leaves turning various shades of amber, rust, and gold. I had no intention of rushing. This was my time to disconnect from the world, to leave behind the noise of work and technology. Just me, nature, and the quiet. The trail was marked clearly with yellow blazes, winding through the dense forest. I had been hiking for about an hour, enjoying the solitude, when the path began to narrow and grow steeper. The climb was demanding, but I was determined to push through. Sweat trickled down my back as I hiked up the jagged rocks, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. My pack felt heavier with each step, but I welcomed the challenge. The quiet was almost deafening, the only sounds being my labored breaths and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. At some point, I noticed something odd, an unnatural silence. It was like the forest had suddenly decided to hold its breath. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. A slight unease crept over me, but I dismissed it. It was just the stillness of the woods, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The trail curved sharply to the right, and I stopped to catch my breath at the bend. Looking ahead, I could see the path narrowing even more, winding between two tall rock faces that loomed like silent sentinels. There was something about the narrow pass that felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was just a feeling, a flicker of discomfort. I continued on, pressing forward, but the unsettling quiet weighed on me. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone behind me or ahead, but there was nothing. The path felt isolated now, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I glanced at my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. It wasn't surprising. Most of the trail was in a dead zone, but it felt strange all the same. The further I went, the more I began to question my decision. This wasn't a heavily trafficked trail, but I had expected to come across at least one or two other hikers. Yet, there was no sign of anyone. The trail stretched ahead of me, empty and eerily quiet. I finally reached a clearing, a small plateau that gave me a panoramic view of the mountains below. It was breathtaking, the landscape sprawling out before me in layers of green and gold, with the peaks of distant mountains dusted with the last remnants of snow. I took a moment to sit on a large rock, removing my pack to rest. I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the solitude and the warmth of the sun on my face. But then I heard it, a noise from the trees, just a soft crack, like a branch snapping. I opened my eyes and scanned the treeline, but there was nothing. The sound hadn't been loud enough to be alarming, but it was enough to set my senses on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a squirrel or a bird that I spent the next few minutes enjoying the view. But the feeling of being watched crept back into my mind. I stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulder, and began walking again, but the air had changed. It was heavier now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the trail ahead was shadowed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. As I descended back into the forest, I noticed the trail becoming less defined, the yellow blazes harder to spot. It was as if the trail was intentionally disappearing. My heart rate picked up a little. I stopped to check my map, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had followed the path carefully, but now it seemed as if the landscape itself was shifting, the trees growing thicker and the path more indistinct. At one point, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led down into a small ravine, while the other continued upward, twisting around the base of a rocky cliff. I checked my map again, but both routes seemed familiar. I chose the downward path, thinking it would be an easier descent. As I ventured deeper into the ravine, the temperature dropped. The trees here were larger, older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss. The light dimmed, as though the canopy above had thickened into an impenetrable blanket. It was strange, the way the woods had changed so abruptly, but I pressed on, eager to finish the hike before nightfall. Minutes turned into hours as I wandered deeper into the ravine, the path barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. I was starting to feel the weariness of the journey, my legs aching and my mind wandering. I hadn't expected to be this exhausted. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding in ways that felt unnatural, almost as if it were leading me in circles. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the disorienting nature of the woods. But with every step, I felt more and more lost. Eventually, I came across something unexpected, an old cabin. It was small, dilapidated, with broken windows and a roof sagging under the weight of time. The sight of it sent a wave of relief through me. Maybe there was someone here, a ranger or a fellow hiker. I approached cautiously, half expecting to find it abandoned. As I reached the door, I froze. The air felt different here, heavier, as though the very earth beneath my feet was holding its breath. I could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, but I didn't dare to open it. Something about the cabin felt wrong. I turned around and started to retrace my steps. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it was almost suffocating. I moved quickly, almost running, trying to get back to the main trail. The woods had become even more oppressive, the trees closing in tighter, blocking out the light. It was as if the forest itself was pushing me deeper into its depths. Minutes passed, but nothing looked familiar. The trail was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and tangled roots. My phone remained useless, no signal at all. My pulse quickened as panic began to set in. I had to find my way out. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on finding a landmark, anything to guide me back. Then, just as I thought I might break down, I saw a familiar yellow blaze on a tree ahead. It was faint but visible, like a distant promise of safety. I hurried toward it, breathing a little easier now. The trail was still there, just hidden beneath the thickening foliage. I followed the trail for what felt like hours, constantly scanning the trees for any sign of human presence. But there was nothing, just the quiet, the shadows, and the path that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, as the sun began to set, I reached the clearing at the edge of the forest. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and orange, and I could see the parking area in the distance. I had made it out. I don't know what happened back there, but I can't shake the feeling that the woods weren't just empty. Some presence had been with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that I won't be hiking that trail again. The woods have a way of making you feel small, insignificant. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest has its own secrets. Some of them, it would be better if they stayed hidden. I'll never forget that camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything. Just me, the wilderness, and the sound of the wind threading through the trees. I wanted something quiet and solitary, a chance to clear my head after months of city noise and the relentless buzz of work. I'd read about the spot, an isolated stretch of forest in a state park that was barely visited, miles away from the main trails. Perfect. I packed light but carefully. My old but reliable tent, a sturdy sleeping bag, a small propane stove, plenty of water, some dehydrated meals, and basic survival gear. I double-checked everything. A whistle, a map, a compass, a fully charged power bank, and a satellite phone. I wasn't planning to take unnecessary risks. Still, being out there alone always carries some level of unpredictability. I wanted to be ready for anything. The drive took about 4 hours. It was the kind of trip where you watch the world change around you. The city gave way to suburbs, then to small towns, and finally to open stretches of road lined with tall pines. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the trailhead, my phone had lost service. I didn't mind. That was the point. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a GPS app on my phone to back up my map and compass. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The first few miles were easy enough. The trees were dense, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled rich and earthy, the way it does after a rain. Every so often, I'd hear the rustle of something small darting through the undergrowth, probably a squirrel or a bird. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, just me and nature. I hiked for about 3 hours before I reached the spot I'd picked on the map. It was a small clearing near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and laying out my gear inside. The creek was close enough that I could hear the water trickling over the rocks, a soft, soothing sound that made the place feel even more peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the small campfire I'd built, and watched the stars come out. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching overhead, a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness. It was beautiful. I stayed up later than I'd planned, just sitting there, listening to the forest and staring at the stars. Eventually, the chill of the night drove me into my tent, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I saw deer tracks near the water and even spotted a small herd grazing in a meadow farther upstream. They looked up when they saw me but didn't run. I'm not sure why, but that moment stayed with me. It felt like I was part of the forest, not just passing through it. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. I made dinner and settled in for another quiet evening by the fire. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt off. It wasn't anything big, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had been so full of sound all day, was suddenly quiet. Not completely silent, but subdued. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth seemed to have faded away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe I just hadn't noticed the change until now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I stayed up later than I had the night before, listening to the quiet and watching the shadows deepen around my camp. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, the snap of a twig, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that presses against your ears. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I froze, straining to identify it. Sounded like breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too regular, too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening, but the sound didn't return. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, every nerve on edge. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the day trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I went for another hike, kept busy with small tasks around camp, but the feeling lingered. That night, I built the fire a little bigger and kept it burning longer. I stayed up as late as I could, but eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. I crawled into my tent, telling myself that the forest was just playing tricks on me, that I'd imagine the sound. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The breathing was back, louder now, more insistent. It was right outside the tent. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, and fumbled it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but I didn't dare open the flap. The breathing continued, slow and steady, until, just like before, it stopped. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with every movement. The forest felt different that morning, heavier somehow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to the car was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, following me. But the trail was empty, the forest as still and silent as it had been the night before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me, that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me doesn't believe that. Part of me knows there was someone, in those woods that night. I'll never go back to find out. I've always preferred solitude. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue. But this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need. A tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried, this was my element. I was used to it. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch, it was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds. Footsteps, breathing, but it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. I was looking forward to this hike. There's something about nature that always calms me. Long stretches of forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the freedom of just being alone with your thoughts. This trail, a moderately difficult one, was supposed to take me through some of the most scenic parts of the area. I'd read about it in hiking forums and seen pictures of the towering trees and sprawling views. It seemed perfect for a weekend trip. Just me, my pack, and the open trail. It was an early Saturday morning when I set out. The sun had barely risen, casting soft rays over the distant peaks. I was used to getting up early for hikes. It's when the air is freshest and the trail the least crowded. My backpack felt light, though I had packed all the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I always made sure to be prepared, even for unexpected situations. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. Nothing about the morning seemed off. The path started wide and smooth, winding through an area of thick trees. The air smelled earthy, rich with the scent of pine and damp soil. Birds chirped above, and every now and then, I'd hear a rustling in the underbrush. Likely squirrels or deer, nothing out of the ordinary. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude and the slow immersion into the forest. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew taller and the forest denser. It felt quieter here, as if the world outside had fallen away. The only sounds were the occasional creak of a branch and my footsteps crunching along the gravel. I looked at the map on my phone. There was a fork coming up in about half a mile. It would be my first real decision of the hike, and I'd already decided I was going to take the less traveled path. Something about it called to me. It wasn't a difficult route, but fewer people seemed to take it, and that made it more appealing. I preferred quiet, peaceful hikes over the more popular routes that were often crowded with groups. When I reached the fork, I followed the smaller path, which veered off to the right. Almost immediately, the trail became steeper. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight, and the ground was covered in loose rocks and fallen leaves. The climb wasn't hard, but it was a bit of a workout. Sweat began to bead on my forehead as I pushed onward. The higher I went, the more the trail seemed to wind around the mountain, and the deeper I ventured into the woods. About an hour later, I stopped for a quick break. I sat on a large rock, sipping water and catching my breath. My phone showed no signal, no surprise, considering how far off the beaten path I had gone. I didn't mind, though. The isolation felt comforting. It was only then that I realized how silent everything had become. Normally, on a hike like this, you'd hear the occasional breeze rustling through the leaves, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But now it was eerily quiet. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no noise, just stillness. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just part of the deep forest atmosphere. I stood up, stretched, and continued walking. The trail began to get rougher as I ascended, and I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping. I was still in good spirits, enjoying the challenge. The climb became steeper, and soon, I was scrambling over loose rocks, using tree roots to pull myself up. There was a part of me that wondered if I should have stuck to the main trail, but I pushed those thoughts away. This was what I'd come for, this sense of raw adventure. After another hour or so, I noticed something strange. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It was a shift in the air, something subtle, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped, looking around. The forest was still as silent as before, but now there was a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle unease, a whisper of something just beyond my sight. I shook it off again, trying to focus on the trail ahead, but the feeling lingered. I continued upward, the incline becoming more challenging. My legs burned with effort, but I was determined to make it to the top. The higher I got, the harder it was to see the trail clearly. It had become a jumble of loose rocks, tree roots, and thick underbrush. The canopy above had thickened, blocking out more light, and soon, the trail became little more than a faint path through the forest. I checked my map, unsure if I was still on the right track. It was hard to tell. I was so far into the wilderness now that the landmarks I had hoped to rely on had disappeared. At some point, the trail seemed to fade completely. I stopped again, trying to get my bearings. My heart was beating a little faster now, not from exertion, but from something else. I glanced around and realized that the silence had deepened. The air felt thick, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I decided to retrace my steps, thinking I had missed a turn or wandered off course. As I backtracked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made me pause and look around. But I saw nothing. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it just my nerves? Or was something out there? Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. I pushed forward more cautiously now. It wasn't until much later that I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was low, and the light was fading fast. I hadn't made it back to the fork I'd passed earlier. Something wasn't right. The woods were eerily still, and my phone had been dead for a while now. I had no way of calling for help, no way to orient myself. Panic set in slowly. I tried to focus on the trail, looking for any familiar signs, but everything felt foreign. The trees, the rocks, the path, nothing looked the same as before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew it was easy to get disoriented in the woods, especially when you're this far off the main trail. I could still hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I walked faster now, hoping to stumble across a clearing or some sign of civilization. But then, as I rounded a corner, I froze. Ahead of me, just at the edge of the trees, there was a figure. It was tall, thin, and completely still. Couldn't make out any details. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could have been a tree or just the light playing tricks, but it didn't move. It was as if it were waiting. For what felt like forever, I just stared, too afraid to move. Then the figure took a slow step forward. I gasped and stepped back, heart racing. I was alone. There was no one else out here. I turned quickly, scrambling to get back to where I thought the trail had been, but I wasn't sure anymore. Every direction looked the same. My mind raced, thoughts swirling in a panic. The sun was almost gone now, and darkness was setting in. That was when I heard the voice. Faint, distant, and barely audible, but it was definitely there. "Hey!" I spun around, but saw nothing. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure what to do. I needed to get out of here. I turned back to the path and ran, slipping on rocks and roots. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, and the fear was overwhelming. My heart thudded in my chest as I forced myself forward. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled back into the clearing where the fork had been. My legs were shaky, and I collapsed onto a nearby rock, gasping for air. I couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. The oppressive feeling was gone. I checked my watch. Just over 3 hours had passed since I had started this whole ordeal. Somehow, I had been lost for hours when it felt like minutes. The hike out was uneventful. The forest seemed ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was the longest hike I'd ever taken, and I couldn't explain what had happened or why I'd gotten lost. I didn't want to dwell on it, but when I finally reached the parking lot, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I was safe back where I belonged. It wasn't until later, as I was looking through the photos I had taken during the hike, that I noticed something strange in one of the pictures. A shadow in the background, just behind a tree, where no one had been when I took it. It made my blood run cold. I deleted the photo immediately. Some things were better left unexplained. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known. The kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth. The perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind, but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a missed-turn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. It felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now, The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head: I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. It's funny how easily people can get lost, even when they think they know exactly where they're going. I've heard people talk about it all the time. I'll just take this shortcut, they say. It's faster, it'll save me time. What they don't realize is that shortcuts often lead to unexpected places, and not always the ones you'd want to find. I never thought it would happen to me, though. I mean, I'm not the type of person who gets lost. I'm a practical guy. I've done a lot of traveling, road trips, camping, hiking, and I'm good with directions. Or at least I thought I was. The whole thing started when I decided to take a different route home from work one night. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and I was tired. My usual route was always the same: the highway to the main road, past the gas station, then a right turn onto a small country road that would take me home. That night, though, something told me to try a shortcut. Maybe I was too eager to get home. Maybe it was because I'd seen a sign for a new road that promised a faster route, or maybe it was just a whim. Whatever the reason, I ignored my instincts and turned onto the new road. First, everything seemed fine. The road was narrow but well paved, and there was barely any traffic. I passed a few houses, some old barns, and a couple of rusted cars parked in front of weather-beaten trailers. Everything seemed pretty normal for the middle of nowhere. The air was crisp, and the quiet of the night was unsettling in a way that made my skin prickle. But I didn't think much of it. After all, I'd been on roads like this before. I drove for what felt like an hour. The farther I went, the more the road twisted and turned, narrowing and fading into a gravel path. I noticed how much darker it was out here. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. Just me, my car, and the headlights slicing through the blackness. A few trees leaned over the road, their branches making eerie shadows that danced in front of my headlights. It didn't bother me at first. I figured the road would open up again soon, like every other shortcut I'd taken in the past. But the more I drove, the more I realized this wasn't just a shortcut. It was an isolated path leading somewhere far from civilization. I checked my phone. No service. Of course, I always forget that out here the signal's spotty at best and non-existent at worst. But it wasn't a big deal. I had enough gas. I knew the general direction of where I was headed, and there was no reason to think anything could go wrong. Then I saw it. A turnoff just ahead. It wasn't marked by any sign, and the road looked even more overgrown than the one I had been on. A small wooden post stuck out from the grass, half-rotted and barely noticeable in the dark. But something about it caught my eye. It seemed off. A chill ran through me as I slowed the car and approached it. The road curved, and I could just make out a small trail leading into the trees. The kind of trail that no one ever uses anymore. The kind that seemed almost like it was begging not to be followed. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned onto that road. I kept driving slowly, hoping that I'd find a clearing or something to break the dense woods surrounding me. The trees closed in tighter as I went on, their branches nearly touching my windshield. It was suffocating. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The silence was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. There wasn't a sound. No animals, no wind rustling through the leaves. Nothing. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The road didn't seem like a road at all anymore. It was more of a rough path, a muddy trail that could barely fit my car. The headlights flickered a few times as I hit potholes and uneven patches of dirt. The further I went, the more it felt like the world around me was closing in. There was no sign of life, no houses, no barns, nothing. Just trees and shadows. And then I saw it. A house. It was small, old, and crooked. The kind of house you'd expect to find in a horror story. Run down, with peeling paint and sagging walls. It sat just off the road, hidden by thick bushes and trees. There was no driveway, no signs of activity, just this abandoned-looking place in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't understand why anyone would live out here, let alone build a house like that. I pulled over and sat there, staring at it for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The air was thick with an unsettling calmness. Something felt wrong about this place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I thought about just driving away, but I was too curious. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be behind that house. Maybe it was just some forgotten relic of the past. Maybe it had an interesting history. Maybe it was just abandoned. But even that seemed strange in a place this remote. Eventually, I decided to take a quick look. What harm could it do? It was late, but I wasn't too far from civilization. I could always turn around if I felt uneasy. I locked my car, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and started walking toward the house. The closer I got, the more I could make out. The roof was half collapsed, the windows boarded up, and the door sagged on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Still, I had to know. I had to see it up close. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. Inside, it was dark, but the flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing dust-covered furniture, broken glass, and what appeared to be old papers scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had lived there at some point, but they'd left a long time ago. There was no sign of life, no fresh footprints, no indication that anyone had been there recently. And then I saw it, a photo partially hidden under a pile of debris. I bent down to pick it up, and as I did, my stomach turned. The photo was old, faded, and yellowed with age. It showed a family, man, woman, and 2 kids. They looked happy, smiling in front of the house, but there was something off about their eyes. Their faces seemed too blank, too empty. I stood up, holding the photo in my hand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a faint sound, a rustling noise from behind me. I froze. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing, but then I heard it again, a soft thump, like something heavy being moved, coming from upstairs. I don't know why I didn't run at that moment. Maybe it was just shock. Maybe I was too curious. Whatever it was, I stood there for a few more seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a louder thump, and then another. It was coming from above me, from the 2nd floor. That was when my instincts kicked in. I didn't even think. I turned and bolted out of the house. My heart was pounding as I ran back to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled to open the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gasping for air. I could feel my pulse in my neck, my whole body tense with adrenaline. I started the engine and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel as I sped down the path, my headlights bouncing wildly through the trees. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that house. I never went back, and I never spoke about it to anyone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. If I'd gone upstairs. What did I hear? Was it just the house? Or something or someone else? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. I had always wanted to spend some time alone, away from the noise of city life, just me and the woods. So when I found a secluded cabin to rent for the weekend, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to disconnect, get some peace, and maybe even clear my head. The cabin wasn't much, small, tucked away on the edge of a forest, but it had everything I needed. There was something about it that felt right, felt like a place where I could breathe, just be myself. The first day was great. The sun was shining through the trees as I unloaded my things from the car. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the sound of birds was calming. The cabin was simple, a wooden structure with a few rooms, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a loft upstairs. The floors creaked with every step, the way old wood does, but that only added to its charm. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, and just stared at the view for hours. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest around the cabin seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The path near the cabin wasn't well maintained, but it was easy to follow. I kept to it, letting my mind wander, taking in the quiet, the isolation. It was peaceful, but as I ventured deeper into the woods, something began to nag at me. Just a small feeling, almost like I was being watched. I brushed it off. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one out here, or at least that's what I thought. When I returned to the cabin, it was dark, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting shadows across the yard. The wind picked up, making the trees sway in strange patterns. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The inside of the cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the fireplace. I could hear the wind outside picking up speed, causing the wooden walls to creak. The place felt alive. I figured it was just the old wood settling. As I sat by the fire, I began to hear a strange noise, a soft thud, like something tapping against the cabin's walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, maybe a branch brushing against the house. But then I heard it again, closer this time, more deliberate. My heart started to race. The fire crackled louder, and I glanced at the windows. Nothing. I tried to shake it off. I stood up, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and looked around the room. Everything was normal. I was just getting paranoid from being alone too long, I told myself. But the noise didn't stop. It continued, tapping against the side of the house like something or someone was gently knocking over and over again. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking slightly, and stepped outside onto the porch. The wind had died down, and the air felt still, almost too still. I shone the beam of light across the yard. Nothing, no movement, but that nagging feeling, the feeling of being watched, was back. I stood there for a long time, listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal, a bird or a squirrel knocking on the cabin. But when I went back inside and tried to sleep, the sound continued.
Top, top, top.
Soft but constant. I covered my head with a pillow and tried to drown it out, but I couldn't. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. I was exhausted, jittery, and had no idea what to make of what had happened. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The wind, animals, my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something I wasn't seeing. I spent the next day trying to push it out of my mind. I went for another walk, this time further into the woods, but the forest felt different. The trees were too quiet. There were no animals, no birds chirping, nothing. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the trees, the dirt, and the emptiness. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my nerves were shot. I decided to leave. I wasn't sure why, but the thought of spending another night there had become unbearable. The place, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting when I first arrived, now felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were closing in on me. I gathered my things quickly, ready to get in my car and drive far away. But when I reached the front door, I froze. It was wide open. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, flashlight raised, heart hammering. The room looked untouched. The fire had gone out hours ago. I was alone, but the feeling of unease in my chest had turned into something much worse. Pure dread. I checked every room, the closets, the loft. There was no one. But then, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the kitchen, next to the pantry, was a small, hand-carved figurine. I hadn't seen it before. It was simple, unassuming, a wooden figure of a person with hollow eyes. The carving was rough, jagged even, and it looked as though it had been made in a hurry. I didn't know why it felt wrong, but it did. It felt like someone had been in here and they had left that thing behind. As a message. That's when the tapping came back.
Top, top, top.
Louder now, from behind the walls. My heart leaped in my chest as I spun around, searching the room for any sign of movement. The tapping came from the ceiling now. It was like someone was pacing up there, stepping across the floorboards in the attic. I ran to the stairs, my legs like lead, and shone the flashlight up into the dark loft. There was nothing. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone else could have been in the cabin. I had locked the door. The only possible explanation was, well, I didn't know, and the uncertainty terrified me. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things, left the figurine on the floor, and ran outside into the woods, back to my car. I didn't even care about the cost of the rental at that point. I just needed to leave. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin. And every time I think about it, I remember the feeling I had that night, the feeling of being watched, the tapping, the figurine. I don't know who or what was there or what it wanted, but I don't ever want to find out. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short drive to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of the city, the stress of work. I'd found the cabin online. The listing said it was remote, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The pictures were beautiful, just the kind of place I thought I could relax and clear my head. A cozy log cabin surrounded by dense trees, a small lake nearby, and a sense of isolation that I thought would be refreshing. It seemed perfect for what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS kept cutting out as I got deeper into the woods, and the road became less of a road and more of a dirt path. The trees were thick, their trunks so close together that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The air smelled different here, fresher, but also damp, like the earth had been soaked for days. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt like something was watching me, but I brushed it off. My mind was just playing tricks. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Rustic, charming, with a small porch that overlooked the lake. It was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in time. I could hear the soft chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked my car and brought in my things. It wasn't long before I had the fire going inside and the cabin felt warm. I could hear the crackle of the wood as the flames danced. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into one of the armchairs by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the water. It looked like the kind of sunset you only see in pictures. Pink and orange streaks across the sky. For a moment, I thought maybe this weekend would be just what I needed. As night fell, the air grew colder. The only sounds were the fire in the hearth and the occasional gust of wind outside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned off the lights, letting the fire provide the only glow in the room. I could hear the wind howling through the trees now, a constant low moan that seemed to shake the walls. It didn't bother me at first, but as the hours wore on, it started to get to me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was comfortable, the sheets cool against my skin. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind outside was louder now, and every now and then I thought I heard something scratching at the walls, just soft enough that it could have been the trees rubbing against the cabin. Still, the sound made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason to be scared. Yet, the sense of isolation felt heavier now. The idea that there was nothing around for miles. The nearest town was an hour away, the nearest person even further. It was quiet here, too quiet. It made me feel exposed, like I was too far from safety. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The sound of something scraping at the window woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt close, too close. I got out of bed and crept to the window, my pulse racing in the silence. Outside, the trees were dark shadows, the night swallowing up everything beyond the porch. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the lake shimmered faintly, reflecting the little light that made it through. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or some other small creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to lock the windows and double-check the doors, just to be sure. When I did, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on the doorknob, like someone had been standing there, pressing against it, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard any footsteps. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The noise outside had stopped, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, trying to calm my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dirt on the doorknob kept coming back. In the morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. The lake looked peaceful, and the trees were still. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch. They weren't there the night before, I was sure of it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking around the cabin for hours, pacing back and forth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that there were footprints, it was the fact that they were fresh. No one had passed by here in days. I hadn't seen anyone, I hadn't heard anyone. And yet here they were, large, heavy prints in the soft mud. I backed away from the porch and stood still, trying to think. My phone had no signal, of course. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, but that meant I was completely isolated. I didn't want to panic, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. For the next couple of hours, I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just some hikers or campers who had passed through. Maybe they had stayed the night, not realizing the cabin was occupied. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The prints weren't from a casual walk. They were deliberate, heavy. They didn't look like someone passing through. They looked like someone who had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of being alone in that cabin, with the strange noises and the footprints, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, more hastily than I would have liked. The whole time, I felt like someone was just outside the window, watching, waiting. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it had turned against me. I was halfway to my car when I heard it again, the soft scratching at the window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The window was shut tight, the glass still. I quickly jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or worse, someone walking behind me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the trees, and the empty miles stretching ahead. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I finally felt some relief. The city seemed so far away, but the sense of safety that came with it was undeniable. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the footprints, the noise, the strange feeling of being watched, it was real. I never went back to that cabin, but I've often wondered, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, if someone was truly out there, waiting for me, or if it was something else entirely, something that the woods had claimed long before I ever arrived. I've always liked camping. Something about being out in the wild, far away from everything, felt like hitting a reset button. Life gets loud, and I've found that nature is the only place quiet enough to clear my head. That's why I decided to go solo this time. No friends, no conversations, just me and the woods. I planned it out carefully, a 2-night trip in a remote area up north, far enough from the usual crowded campgrounds. I had my tent, a sturdy backpack full of supplies, and a mapped-out route that I studied for hours beforehand. I wasn't new to this kind of thing. I'd been camping since I was a teenager. I knew how to read maps, how to purify water, how to stay calm when things went sideways. Or at least I thought I did. Started out fine. The hike to my campsite was about 6 miles in, mostly uphill but manageable. I reached a clearing around 3 p.m., set up my tent, and made a small fire to boil some water for dinner. The air smelled clean, the trees whispered in the wind, and everything felt right. No phone service, no distractions, just how I liked it. The first night passed without incident. The wind picked up a bit after midnight, rustling the leaves outside, but nothing unusual. I woke up once to the sound of something moving through the underbrush, but I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging for food. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came and I felt refreshed. I brewed some coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a stream about half a mile from my camp, so I hiked down to refill my water bottles. The water was cold and clear, and the forest felt alive around me. Birds called from the treetops, squirrels darted through the branches, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. A shoe. It was lying near the edge of the stream, half buried in the mud. A men's hiking boot, scuffed and worn but still intact. It seemed out of place, too far from any trail, and there was no sign of its owner. I picked it up and looked around, but there was nothing else, just the boot. I set it back down and tried not to think too much about it. People lose things in the woods all the time, right? Maybe someone had passed through here months ago, lost their boot and kept going barefoot or with a spare. Still, it left an uneasy feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I headed back to camp and spent the rest of the day sticking closer to my tent. I read a book, gathered some firewood, and tried to keep my mind busy. By the time the sun started to set, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Just a boot, no big deal. But that night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it again, that sound in the underbrush. It was soft at first, like something brushing against the leaves. Then it grew louder, moving closer to my camp. I froze. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and slow, circling just outside the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped the second the light hit the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed in my tent, clutching my knife, every sound making my heart race. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. Something wasn't right. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started back toward the trailhead. I tried to move quickly, but not so fast that I'd miss my footing. The trail felt different now, darker, quieter. About 3 miles in, I found something else. A campsite, or what was left of one. There was a collapsed tent, torn open at the front, with the fabric flapping in the wind. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered. Nearby, there was a backpack with its contents spilled across the ground. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight with dead batteries. No people, no signs of a struggle, just abandoned. My pulse quickened. I scanned the area, but there was nothing else. No boot prints, no blood, nothing to tell me what had happened here. I debated whether to search the surrounding area, but my gut told me to keep moving. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the empty trail, and my own footsteps echoing in the silence. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, just listening to the hum of the engine. I didn't see anyone else in the parking lot. I never did find out what happened at that campsite. I told a ranger about it when I got back to town, but he just nodded and said they'd check it out. Part of me wanted to press for answers, but another part of me was relieved to leave it behind. That night, back in my apartment, I lay in bed replaying everything in my head. The boot by the stream, the footsteps in the dark, the abandoned tent. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for all of it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong out there in those woods. And I'm not sure I'll ever go camping alone again.